Hello and welcome to video 1 of my tutorial series for Gregorian Chant for Beginners. As a first note, I would like to make a point about the word sacred. We will come upon that word a lot in our discussion of Gregorian Chant and sacred music. Now, sacred comes from the Latin sacer, which means holy, set apart. And then the contrasting word that you often hear in church music documents is profane, which comes from two Latin words, profanum, which means outside the temple. So profane doesn't necessarily mean bad or evil or inappropriate. It means that it is not for a sacred space. It's for other purposes. So an example of that would be some religious music, even though it's Christian and good or uplifting in different ways. If it's not of a certain character and it has, for instance, a tune that's like a pop tune or something like that, that's music of the outside world that's used for other things. It's appropriate in certain places, in a diner or, in your praise and worship band in your garage, or, even maybe you could sing it in church, but not necessarily during a liturgy. Liturgy is specific from praise and prayer. It's different because liturgy is the worship of God as God himself requested to be worshipped. He did this in the Old Testament with the temple rites and ceremonies of that Levitical age, and then after the coming of Christ, when he instituted the Mass and handed that on to the disciples, he was showing us how he wanted to be remembered and worshipped. And the apostles have kept that going through the millennia. It's been handed down from apostle to pope to bishop to priest, and now that's what we see in our churches, is that tradition of worship and liturgy that started with Jesus himself. So it's very specific, it's very important, and we should be very grateful for such a gift. I mean, God himself came down and revealed to us so many things that we could no other way have known without him doing that. And it's a wonderful heritage. It's rich and beautiful, and this music and ceremony that has grown out of centuries of the worship of God, it's, that's ours in the Catholic tradition. It's our heritage, and it's something to be preserved and appreciated. So it's something the church still requests that we respect today and observe in our proper worship of God. Properly speaking, you can praise and pray anywhere, in any way that you like, but worship is what happens in the Mass. The Mass is something special that's set apart from everything else we do. It's different, and that's not a bad thing. And it doesn't mean that everything that doesn't belong in the Mass is bad or that it has no place. It's sort of like pepper doesn't go in tea. It just doesn't fit. It doesn't taste good, but pepper is great on scrambled eggs or casseroles. So pepper has a place. It's not discriminating against pepper to say it doesn't go well in your tea, because it still has a good place to go and to be appreciated. So with religious music or contemporary architecture or vestments or whatever, like elements from the outside, things that were profane, that came from outside the temple, that didn't organically grow from the liturgy and the worship of God and the celebration of the sacraments, those things have a place. They have goodness, but it doesn't belong in the Mass just because we like it. That's one thing that's a little hard for people to understand. Also, we have in our modern day, and especially our American culture, very little notion left of what is sacred, what is supposed to be set apart. A friend of mine recently was kind of bemoaning to me the fact that if you try to think of examples of sacred things, to help people understand that certain things are always set apart for a specific use, and that that's not really a new concept. He said, usually I can only think of negative things like a dump and a mortuary and places, jail. It's like, I said, that's kind of a problem you have there. But I did think of one good example that I think might help our discussion of this. If you think about a wedding dress communicates something. When you see it, you automatically think of vows and ceremony and promises and a bride and groom and all the things that go with the wedding. It's not the kind of garment that you just see someone wear when they go out to a movie or to a restaurant or to play basketball in. They wear a wedding dress to a wedding when certain things are going to happen and be done. It represents something. It's special. It means something. It's good and it's special and it's set apart. So that happens with a wedding dress. And that's a good example of sacred music and other things like that in the Mass. It's set aside for that special purpose alone. You may love Gregorian chant to listen to help you while you go to sleep. But even while you listen to it while you're going to sleep, it speaks to you of something else. It speaks to you of that from which it came. And it communicates a certain message. It's all about God. And it sounds right. If you walk into a church and you hear Gregorian chant, you're like, that fits. If you walk into a church and hear nightclub music, you're going to wonder if you're in the right place. Or it just is incongruous. If you walked into a clothing store, and this is an example from Professor William Mart, the president of the Church Music Association of America. I loved this lecture that he gave one time. And he said, if you walk into a clothing store and you hear a Gregorian chant, you're like, well, that's really nice, but it doesn't really fit. It doesn't have anything to do with what I'm shopping for. And if you walk into a Catholic church and you hear, nightclub music or blues, you say, where's my martini? You're confused immediately, your senses. Even if you're used to hearing nightclub music after a certain point when you walk into church, that doesn't mean that it belongs. It means that you just became accustomed to it because it was there for so long, because people were putting it there, not because it fit. So I'm trying to teach you the concept of sacred versus profane, understanding that profane doesn't necessarily mean bad, it just means not of the temple, and sacred is set apart for the temple, and the temple is the church of God, and then the Mass, what happens in the temple. So that's a concept I just need you to understand before we get into any more discussion, because in the workshops I've given in the past, we run aground on this. I'll be all gung-ho into singing with people and teaching them the nuts and bolts, and then I start talking about the ins and outs of sacred music in the church documents, and people look at me with this feeling like something is being taken away from them and they don't understand why. They don't know why I'm making a distinction between one thing and another. So right away I want to get that cleared up so that you feel like you have a handle on it and you're not going to feel threatened. You can understand that there's a good reason for all of this and there's a place for everything good. I've even wondered to myself why we don't in the church, especially the Catholic Church, where there's a great number of religious songs and hymns for different seasons of the year, why we don't establish regular caroling times for Easter and Christmas, for instance, where we all gather in the church and sing our Christian, religious, uplifting hymns together and have that communal experience of a wonderful thing that's part of our heritage too, even maybe just our cultural religious heritage as Christians in America, for instance. It's not something that's done. Instead of that, people think if they like something, or if it's a good religious song, or an old time-honored hymn, even from the Protestant tradition, well, why can't we have it at Mass? It's perfectly good music. It's like, it's perfectly good music, but it's not necessarily perfectly good for the Mass. That's one thing specifically about Gregorian chant. It's not just a form of music that is appropriate to the Roman liturgy. It's music that grew out of the Roman rite liturgy. It came from the Mass. Some of the same melodies we sing today in Gregorian chant, our Lord and the Apostles sang in the New Testament. They were sung in the Old Testament. They were way back from the Psalms being first written. They have stayed and developed, and it's part of our musical heritage today. It's something that has grown with the liturgy over time. It's part of it intrinsically. It can't be separated from it. That's why you'll never see chant forgotten about in the church completely and then show up somewhere else like, oh, now this is music for when we have football games. We're going to sing Gregorian chant, and it's just going to fit. It's not ever going to be like that. It's special, and it's going to stay special because it just can't be separated from the Roman rite. So anyway, that's just a little bit to get you going, and we'll begin now with our next part of the video series. Thanks for watching.